Greetings and salutations, everybody. It's XLJ the OG, and welcome back to Back in the Day. Now, here on Back in the Day, we like to take a look back at the rich history of World Championship Wrestling. And we're going to start that off this week with our top story of the week. And man, oh man, this is one of the biggest, not only moments in World Championship Wrestling, but one of the biggest moments in all professional wrestling. And I'm talking about essentially the birth of the New World Order. So we're going to go all the way back to the May 27th, 1996 episode of WCW Monday Nitro. So in this particular episode of WCW Nitro from May 27th of 1996, was just like every other Nitro at the time. In the ring, you had Mike Enos squaring off against Steve Dahl. Then you could hear a ruckus in the crowd. What could it possibly been? A shocking moment indeed, as Scott Hall showed up in World Championship Wrestling. The thing is, they tried to make this angle as real as possible, and boy, oh boy, did it send shockwaves throughout the wrestling community. Because you gotta keep in mind, this is a time frame where really, like, publications like the dirt sheets and whatnot are around, but, I mean, it's not as accessible as, say, I could look it up on the internet or on my phone in 2 seconds or less. So when Scott Hall showed up, pretty much everybody thought the same thing. Oh my God, Razor Ramon's in WCW. What's going on here? Clad in a denim vest and jeans that would make your Uncle Rico super jealous, as Scott Hall would come through the crowd and interrupt the match that was going on in the ring. Now, there was so much confusion going on, too, because Mike Enos, who was wrestling at the time, just looked on and had no idea what the hell was going on. But you'll never forget when Scott Hall jumped in the ring, gone on that mic, and said the infamous words, "You know who I am, but you don't know why I'm here." It was so interesting, too, because Scott would go on pretty much to declare war on WCW. But what is the most fascinating thing about this is how it was presented. Because he didn't come out and say his name was Scott Hall. He didn't come out and say his name was Razor Ramon. It was just implied, but you knew exactly who this was. The wrestling fans knew who it was, and it was just a shocking moment. I can still remember being a kid watching this and just being awestruck and could not understand why Razor Ramon was in WCW. But of course, as we all know, Scott Hall and Kevin Nash's contracts were up in the World Wrestling Federation. They were offered huge money contracts to come over to World Championship Wrestling, and, well, the rest, they say, is history. But Eric Bischoff, give the devil credit where credit is due. He had the wherewithal and the smartness to go ahead and bring in both of these guys, but present them like they were WWF guys. But they were going with more like a reality-based type of storyline. And by gosh, man, this is something we're still talking about to this day, pretty much almost 30 years later. At the time, this was easily the biggest moment that had happened to WCW Nitro to date. And dare I say, it probably is the greatest moment in Nitro history. And that, my friends, is our big story of the week, with Scott Hall making his WCW debut in 1996. Now, for this week's match of the week, we're going to go all the way back to 1991. We're going to go to an event that really a whole lot of people harp on this pay-per-view. It's not the greatest, but man, oh man, there's some great matchups on this show. There's at least a couple. And this match we're going to talk about today is definitely a highlight. So we're going back to WCW Halloween Havoc 1991. And we were talking about the main event, the 2 out of 3 falls match for the WCW World Heavyweight Championship between champion Lex Luger and challenger Ron Simmons. Now, when you look back at this time frame in World Championship Wrestling, Lex Luger had finally climbed the mountaintop after Ric Flair had left WCW and vacated the title. So Lex Luger was pretty much pushed as a babyface at first, but was then utilized more so as a heel, considering Sting was really the top babyface, and that's another story for another time. But in order to make Lex Luger more of a heel, they grouped him up with Harley Race, the former 8-time World Heavyweight Champion, who had been a heel all throughout his career. Harley Race would become the manager of Lex Luger, and Lex Luger would run roughshod through World Championship Wrestling throughout 1991. However, at the same time frame, you have Ron Simmons being turned into a top-tier babyface. Now, keep in mind, at this point, Ron Simmons has primarily worked in a tag team with Butch Reed, Doom. However, at the early onset of 1991, Butch Reed had turned on Ron Simmons after they lost the World Tag Team Championship at Wrestle War 91 to the Fabulous Freebirds. And thus, Ron Simmons would be sent down a path of becoming one of the more popular babyfaces in WCW. After his feud concluded with Butch Reed, Ron Simmons was put in a main event spotlight, and that would lead to his first ever WCW World Heavyweight Championship match at Halloween Havoc 1991. I'll never forget the build-up for this, too. I mean, it was crazy. Like, just how the storyline went, because, I mean, they said and did some stuff that you just could not get by with doing nowadays. I mean, Harley Race and Lex Luger talking about, like, Ron Simmons could become their servant. Yikes! But Ron Simmons had a ton of momentum going into this matchup. I'll never forget the build-up and the vignettes for this. Like, I'll never forget the video they showed of Ron Simmons training at Florida State University. His coach, the famous Bobby Bowden, talking like so many great things about Ron Simmons and his career and how he was pretty much going to go and win the World Heavyweight Championship. Going into this clash at the Halloween Havoc 1991, as we have already established, Harley Race would be in the corner of Lex Luger. However, Ron Simmons needed a quarter man, and he turned to the one and only American Dream. Dusty Rhodes would be his corner man in this 2 out of 3 Falls Championship encounter. And I find the matchup was very interesting in a sense that, like, both of these guys have very similar backgrounds, with Lex Luger playing college football as well as playing in the CFL. And, of course, Ron having one of the most storied careers in all of college football. And this matchup, man, it started off with a bang, and a real shocker, Ron Simmons would win the very first fall in this matchup, and it was just like, whoa, Ron Simmons is going to beat Luger for this championship. So when it comes to the second fall, Ron had all the momentum, but it was Harley Race who would ultimately cost Ron Simmons this fall, as he would hold on to Ron Simmons' trunks, while it appeared that Ron was dumping Lex Luger over the top rope, which was an automatic disqualification in these days in World Championship Wrestling. Now, with the match tied up 1-1, but Ron still had all the momentum. However, Lex Luger would catch him off guard, hit his Attitude Adjuster piledriver, and pick up the third and deciding fall, and thus would retain his World Heavyweight Championship. But still, this was a tremendous moment for Ron Simmons, as this was his first time ever getting a World Championship matchup. And of course, a year later, he would go on to have that very historic moment where he did win his first World Heavyweight Championship. But I highly encourage you to go back and check out Halloween Havoc 1991's main event between Lex Luger and Ron Simmons in a 2 out of 3 Falls match. It's our match of the week here on Back in the Day. Now, there have been some intense and great rivalries all throughout the years in World Championship Wrestling. And today we're going to take a look at one of those great rivalries, and this is another guilty pleasure of mine. I loved this rivalry back in 1994 to 1995, even into 1996, really. These competitors have phenomenal chemistry with each other. So the rivalry we're talking about this week is that between Harlem Heat and the Nasty Boys. And there was just something about these four when they got in the ring, man. They just had phenomenal chemistry with each other. So the Nasty Boys towards 1994 had went from being a top heel tag team to one of the top babyface tag teams in all of WCW. And Harlem Heat was really on the rise in WCW in this time frame. The first true encounter I remember between these two teams goes all the way back to Starrcade 1994, as they would have a tag team matchup, but there was just something special and different about this matchup. Not even with a World Tag Team Championship on the line, they didn't necessarily need. It was just a great, solid back and forth match between these two teams. And what's all the more fascinating about this time frame too is Harlem Heat hadn't even won one of their record-setting 10 WCW Tag Team Title Championship reigns. So really this matchup was just to see who would be the top in the pecking order in the tag team division in World Championship Wrestling. And of course, a huge part of this story was in fact Sensational Sherry, or should I say Sister Sherry. Now the Nasty Boys will go on to beat Harlem Heat by disqualification at Starrcade 94. But this was just the beginning of their rivalry. Now, in the beginning of 1995, Harlem Heat would go on to win the WCW World Tag Team Championship. And they would go into the Super Brawl 5 pay-per-view and would defend those tag team championships against, you guessed it, the Nasty Boys. Now, Harlem Heat would retain their tag team championships in this encounter at Super Brawl 5 as they would win by disqualification. So back and forth, some traded wins between these two teams by DQ. So something had to change about that. Obviously, we'd have to change the rules, and that's exactly what they did at WCW Uncensored 1995, as they would compete in a wild Texas Tornado tag team encounter. It was a wild match, too. Just these guys brawling all over the arena, and a lot of the matchup ended up in the concession stands. And boy, oh boy, as a long-time wrestling fan, I love me a good old concession stands fight. I mean, they involved everything from cotton candy to soda to mustard. Here you can see poor Stevie Ray was covered and doused in mustard. Now, the Nasty Boys would ultimately win this matchup. However, the Tag Team Championship was not on the line in this match. So throughout the early part of 1995, the Nasty Boys were just chasing down Harlem Heat to try to regain their World Tag Team Championship. And this would come to a head at Slamboree 1995. Now, the stipulation going into this matchup was if the Nasty Boys could not defeat Harlem Heat, they would never get a shot at the World Tag Team Championship again, while Harlem Heat held those belts. Now, on the pre-show on WCW's main event, the Nasty Boys did encounter the Blue Bloods, as William Regal and Sir Robert Eaton jumped both Jerry Saggs and Brian Knobbs and beat them down. So much so that Brian Knobbs sustained some serious rib injuries. And come time for the pay-per-view, Jerry Saggs had to go on his own to wrestle Harlem Heat. But he was not about to lose that last opportunity for the World Tag Team Championship, regardless if his partner was able to go or not. Saggs was a tough hombre, and he held his own for a good bit throughout this matchup with Harlem Heat. However, Brian Knobbs would triumphantly make his way to the ring with taped ribs, would tag in, and would help Jerry Saggs defeat Harlem Heat and thus reclaim their World Tag Team Championship. Now, next month at the Great American Bash pay-per-view, the Blue Bloods, who had already inserted themselves kind of into this rivalry, or at least in the tag team title hunts, would go on to challenge the Nasty Boys for the World Tag Team Championship. Now, earlier on this show, Harlem Heat had defeated Bunkhouse Buck and Dirty Dick Slater to become the new #1 contenders for the World Tag Team Championship. However, the rivalry between the Nasties and Harlem Heat was still going strong as Harlem Heat would come out in this matchup and tries to cause some interference. However, the Nasty Boys would retain their World Tag Team Championship. This would lead to a first ever in World Championship Wrestling triangle tag team match for the World Tag Team Championships at Bash at the Beach 1995, where Harlem Heat and the Blue Bloods would challenge the Nasty Boys for those WCW Tag Team titles. And ultimately, Harlem Heat would win back the World Tag Team Championship. Seriously, you just have Harlem Heat and the Nasty Boys wrestle each other 100 times, and it's still going to be entertaining as hell. Now, at this point, they did end up stopping the rivalry as Harlem Heat would go on and face other challengers, as well as the Nasty Boys to kind of move on and do their own thing. However, they would have a matchup a year later at the WCW Fall Brawl of 1996, where both these teams would wrestle for the World Tag Team Championship once again. And the Nasty Boys would be the challengers in this matchup. And it just goes to show, even after a year, these guys still were killing it in the ring, as this match literally almost stole the show. Keep in mind, though, this is the same pay-per-view where the infamous War Games match between the WCW and NWO happened. But I'm telling you, this is a rivalry you don't want to sleep on, as these guys were highly competitive throughout the years, and always they put on phenomenal, tremendous, fun matchups. Just great tag team wrestling, back and forth. Harlem Heat versus the Nasty Boys is your rivalry of the week here on Back in the Day. Now, if you follow me on TikTok and other social media avenues, you know I'm a huge collector of wrestling merch. I love it, just like any other wrestling fan. And one of the things I love to collect is magazines. So here on Back in the Day, we always like to take a look back at some of these great magazines throughout the years of World Championship Wrestling. And for this week's magazine, we're going to be taking a look at WCW Magazine from June 1999. So here on the cover, you can see the Macho Man and Gorgeous George. And I always loved the Macho Man, but I felt like this was like midlife crisis Macho Man. But God, I loved him nonetheless. Oh, right off the bat, we're getting into some results. Let's take a look at Spring Stampede of 1999 and the results. And I got to tell you, folks, this is a hidden gem of a matchup. Juventud Guerrero against Blitzkrieg from Spring Stampede 1999 is a phenomenal matchup. We also got a hardcore matchup with Hardcore Hack, a.k.a. the Sandman, against Bam Bam Bigelow. And this is a time frame in WCW when they were doing like one hardcore match a pay-per-view, essentially. And, I mean, the hardcore division really existed in the WWF and, of course, ECW. But WCW was starting to get in on the craze as well by doing these hardcore matches. And here's a random match for you. Scotty Riggs went one-on-one with Mikey Whipwreck. And Conan against Disco Inferno. And just think, years later, they would host a podcast where Disco Inferno would be a bitter asshole. Here's another incredible matchup. Check out Rey Mysterio Jr. against Kidman for the Cruiserweight Championship. And speaking of great matchups, here is a tag match with Dean Malenko and Chris Benoit from the Four Horsemen going up against Perry Saturn and Raven. And in the finals of the United States Heavyweight Championship Tournament, Scott Steiner would go up against Booker T. And in a grudge match, Goldberg would go one-on-one against Kevin Nash and defeat Big Sexy, thus exacting some revenge from that Starrcade 98 loss. How about this one? What a main event this was. Hollywood Hogan, Ric Flair, Diamond Dallas Page, and Sting for the World Heavyweight Championship in a fatal four-way. And what is interesting about this is Diamond Dallas Page would win his very first ever World Heavyweight Championship by defeating these three legendary Hall of Famers. And yes, the Macho Man Randy Savage was the referee for this matchup. Brain reaction with Bobby the Brain Heenan, as the great Bobby the Brain Heenan gives all of his insight on everything that was going on in World Championship Wrestling at the time frame. Here's a story on Hollywood Hogan, time to reflect. Now, Hollywood Hogan would be injured in that Spring Stampede matchup, and thus, at the time, it was thought, well, maybe it's time for the Hulkster to hang up his boots. Oh, and this is such a sad story, too. Love the title, by the way, cut the music. But this was a story on the late, great Ravishing Rick Rude who had just passed away. Such an incredible performer. He died way too soon. And he was an integral part of World Championship Wrestling in the 90s. Themes, photos of Rick Rude. Also, here's a title history of Rick Rude's championship reigns. And look, it even includes his Intercontinental Championship run in the WWF. Oh, yes. The Ayatollah of Rock and Roll, baby. Inside the Jungle by Lionheart Chris Jericho. Oh, you know it's good. Hello, Jerichoholics. The sad story of the cultural phenomenon known as Ralphus. And yes, that's Ralphus in a dress. Who doesn't remember this? WCW NWO Thunder for PlayStation. Oh, K-Dog's Low Ride. I see what they did there. I love, too, how they have the wrestlers, quote-unquote, contribute articles, you know, like, yo, what up? Word. There we go. An ad for the WCW hotline, 1-900-909-9900. Okay, and like in our fold-out, looks like we got a picture of Hollywood Hulk Hogan. As well as, yes, that is Hardcore Hack, a.k.a. the Sandman. Oh, and we even got a poster of the Macho Man and Gorgeous George. This rare gem, an ad for WCW.com. And here we go on the cover story. It's talking about the perfect match, the Macho Man Randy Savage and Gorgeous George. I find it very interesting because if you don't know the story behind Gorgeous George, essentially Randy Savage discovered her, at all places, a strip club, and thus gave her a career in professional wrestling. And once again, I love me some Macho Man, but this is totally midlife crisis Macho Man. He's going out, he's buying the Corvette, he's dating the young girl, but hey man, hey, if you got it, why not? Look at the Macho Man kissing Gorgeous George there by the San Francisco Bridge and just posing. I feel like I need this on like a poster encouraging me to do great things with my life. Jesus, what seventh dimension of hell did this guy come from? Okay, so this is Perfecto, and they pretty much just took parts of the anatomy here from different wrestlers. So it's got the hair of Kevin Nash, the eyes of Wrath, the smile of Kidman, the chest of Buff Bagwell, the arms of Buff, the abs of Lex Luger, and the legs of Bill Goldberg. Yikes. Ah, and yes, we can't forget about WCW Nitro for the Nintendo 64. Okay, yeah, this game pretty much sucked. And here's a story on Rey Mysterio Jr. And Ray had just come off a couple months prior losing his mask for the first time in his career. But man, he was on fire at this point, holding both the World Tag Team Championship and the Cruiserweight Championship. Had an awesome tag team partnership and rivalry with Billy Kidman. And it's kind of like the early onset for the Filthy Animals, really. Oh, here's a story on Hardcore Hack. I'm the king of the extreme. Yes, you are, my friend. It's still amazing to me to think that the Sandman did compete in WCW for a very brief time frame. Look at this. You could buy replica championship belts back then even. Look at that. $125 for the big gold. How about that? And you know we got to get some of that WCW merch. Remember in the 90s when bucket hats were popular? How cool would you be if you had that NWO Wolfpack bucket hat? Speaking of the Wolfpack, look at that adorable little stuffed wolf. Got some Sting Wolfpack merch, Goldberg hats, some watches. Oh, and of course, we can't forget the Looney Tunes tie-in. Check out that DDP Bugs Bunny shirt. Yes, even a Bam Bam Bigelow shirt. Oh, look, you can get WCW and NWO Thunder for only $49.95. And oh, man, look at this advertisement to close it out. I totally had the Buff Bagwell figure because I totally remember it coming with the wheelchair. And I had that Conan, too, with the crashable garbage can. Good times. Good times. And finally, we got an ad here for WCW's The Great American Bash, June 13th, 1999. The June 1999 edition of WCW Magazine is our Magazine of the Week here on Back in the Day. And finally, here on Back in the Day, we always like to take a look at some merch from World Championship Wrestling throughout the years. And they had some unique merch, just like any other wrestling company throughout the years. Today, I want to highlight WCW comic books that were released in 1992 to 1993 by, of all people, Marvel Comics. Marvel Comics actually published 12 issues of World Championship Wrestling. But pretty much like the comics just cover like the struggle between, you know, heels and baby faces and World Championship Wrestling and that dynamic. And I mean, you had all the major players like Ravishing Rick Rude, you had Sting, Lex Luger, Ron Simmons, and I mean, everybody from the roster, from the Steiner brothers to, yes, El Gigante, was featured in these comic books. Like, pretty much in the very first issue, they have a battle royal to determine the new number one contender for the World Heavyweight Champion. And ironically enough, Ron Simmons wins that battle royal. And thus, Lex Luger comes through the crowd in like a trench coat. Like, you can't recognize Lex Luger. Come on, man. Jumps Ron Simmons, essentially gives him a pile driver on the winner's trophy. Good times. But as a comic fan, the artwork on these is pretty cool. And I mean, the stories, they're not half bad. It's just so bizarre that World Championship Wrestling would have a partnership with Marvel Comics. And you got to keep in mind, too, Marvel Comics was not the juggernaut back in the 90s that it is now. Matter of fact, Marvel Comics at points was almost on death's door. If you look back in this time frame, Marvel was licensing all sorts of different other brands. I mean, everything from the hit 80s show Alf to Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. But these comic books were fun to read. The covers were always awesome. They stood out. I had some of these as a kid, and honestly, I would love to go ahead and collect all 12 of them and have them in my collection again. WCW Comic Books is our merch of the week here on Back in the Day. Well, that's going to about wrap it up for this episode of Back in the Day. And as always, please hit that like and subscribe button and follow World Championship Wreckage, who has a ton of amazing shows on this channel. And if you like some of the content on here, head on over to our YouTube channel, Cole TV, where you get all sorts of amazing content about professional wrestling and so much more. Now, this week on Cole TV, it is our Memorial Day weekend spectacular, where we have prediction shows for Night of Champions, Double or Nothing, Learning the Ropes. We continue talking factions as we're talking to the Bullet Club, a brand new episode of our hit show Friday Night Movie Night, and a special live episode of Pro Wrestling 60 is coming Memorial Day night at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. But head on over to Cole TV where you can catch some of these replays and so much more. Well, that's going to wrap it up for this episode. And once again, please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. Until next time, I'm XLJ the OG, and we'll see you on another episode of Back in the Day.